Hey everyone, we're just going to get right into this. So please open your Bibles to the book of Numbers as we move along in our overview study of the Bible, trying to do each book in the span of just one lesson. And I will note that for those keeping track, I've so far kept every book to one lesson. Some may have thought that I would not, but that's okay. We're making it. We're in the book of Numbers, and the book of Numbers begins this way. Numbers chapter 1, verse 1. We're going to read that. Verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month and the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. And so let's take some time here at the beginning to just kind of orient ourselves based on verse 1 with where we are in the overall story of Israel. That's really the overall story of the Bible. You know, what's our setting? Who is speaking? The Lord is who's speaking, and He's speaking from the tent of meeting, but not just from the tent of meeting. That's how the book of Leviticus begins. The Lord calls to Moses from the tent of meeting. Moses is outside of it. Now, Moses has been brought into the tent of meeting, and he's able to be with God, in a sense, face to face. Who is this Lord that we've been looking at over the last several weeks as he's revealed himself in the Pentateuch? Well, he's our creator and our covenant-making and covenant-keeping God, right? We've seen that really highlighted in the book of Genesis, but also just sort of throughout. He is our creator and covenant-making and keeping God. He has made promises to Abraham in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, where he calls Abram to leave his house, to leave his father's land, and go to the land that he will show him, right? He confirms those same promises by the covenant ceremony in Genesis 15, verses 17 through 20, and then he confirms those same promises again with the sign of the covenant, that being the sign of circumcision in Genesis 17, 3 to 10. And we've seen God's faithfulness to that covenant promise for the last several books. And now, in the book of Numbers, they're finally on the march to the land. Who does the book of Exodus reveal the Lord to be? Does anybody remember from the book of Exodus a couple weeks ago, Redeemer, right? That's what we said. He reveals himself to be Redeemer. He is our Redeemer. And why did he deliver us? He delivered us that we might dwell with him, that we might be with him. And the book of Exodus is really about the deliverance and for that purpose. And we said last week, and I think 2 weeks ago, in the book of Exodus as well, that it ends on the problem of Moses not being able to enter the tabernacle. Do you remember that, right? Not being able to dwell with God. Even the most holy amongst all the people could not dwell with him. Why is that? Because God's holy. Simple. And we are not. What's the solution? The solution is the book of Leviticus. And we'll walk through probably the most important chapter in the book of Leviticus, chapter 16, the Day of Atonement. And it speaks of the two goats. The one who was slain to show the penalty, for sin being paid, and the other one who is the scapegoat, who has the sins of the people confessed over him and is led away into the wilderness, showing the sins being put out of the camp, being outside. So one showing the debt being paid, and another showing the remembrance of that debt being taken away. And that's really what Leviticus does, what it shows us. And so because that system has been instituted, now in this verse 1 of chapter 1 of Numbers, we see that Moses is speaking with the Lord in the tent. Okay, he is welcome in the presence of God because of the sacrifice and the shed blood of the Lamb. So that's where we're at on the narrative level. We've also broken down the Pentateuch this way. We've said that that Genesis reveals God as creator, Exodus reveals him as redeemer, Leviticus as the sanctifier. He is making his people holy, and today the book of Numbers. And for those of you who remember from previous weeks, we've said really that this reveals God as the protector of his people. So he's created his people. He has redeemed his people. He is sanctifying them. And now in Numbers, we will see how he protects them. And so this evening, as we focus on that topic, we'll see really, I think, three things in the book of Numbers. And before I get to those three things, I know that this is a book that we're probably not as familiar with as we are with, Genesis and Exodus, things like that. And last week, you may recall that I posited that a reason that we're not that familiar with, say, Leviticus is that there's almost no narrative in it, right? There's almost no story. It's just a list of procedures and rules. Numbers is almost the complete opposite. There are so many episodes going on here, so many tales and so many stories. I don't like the word tales because it suggests not true. So there are so many records of things that happened in the book that we just cannot possibly cover them all in this lesson. But I've tried to organize them as best I can under these three headings. So by all means, go back and look at the book of Numbers this week. But the three headings will be this. Okay, so chapters 1 through 10 show how God protects his people by preparing his people. He protects them by preparing them. Chapters 11 through the first half of 21 will show us how God protects his people by purifying them. And so God protects his people by purifying them. And then the final section, chapters 21 through 36, will show how God protects his people by preserving them. So he protects them by preparing, purifying, and preserving. And so looking back now to chapter 1, this is what we read. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month and the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel by clans, by fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male head by head from 20 years old and upward, all in Israel who are able to go to war. You and Aaron shall list them company by company. So this is in a large part where the book gets its name, Numbers. It's a list, it's a numbering of the people. The book of Numbers both begins and ends with this process of numbering the people. And specifically, it's the people, it's the young men that are of age to go to battle, because in marching through the wilderness, they are going to encounter enemy kings. They're going to encounter armies, enemy territory, and they need to have their men who are of age to go into battle prepared. And this preparation really continues into chapter 2, where the Lord, he not only counts them, but he organizes them. He organizes them, and we won't read through all of the details of that, but I've actually put the formulation that the book of Numbers gives you in chapters 2, in chapters 2, for where he organizes who. But the point is, The point is that they're all organized over the tabernacle, and it says in Numbers chapter 2 that let's read that real quick. It says in Numbers chapter 2 that when they've camped, Numbers 2 verse 2, the people of Israel shall camp each by his own standard with the banners of their fathers' houses, and they shall camp facing the tabernacle on every side, facing the tent of meeting on every side. So he's organizing the 12 tribes around the tabernacle. And what do you suppose that is intended to communicate? What's he trying to tell us by that? Israel centered around God, right? Everything they do is to be centered around and focused on the Lord. The Lord who dwells in their midst, he is the one that is guiding them and leading them into the land, into this promised land, right? Into the land that he promised their fathers, is what I'm trying to say. And this centrality of being organized around God is really hammered home in just the next couple chapters of this section, where the focus is heavily on the Levites. And you'll notice that if you took the time to count these, there's 11 on the outside, and the tribe of Levi is actually an exception. And they are to serve directly in the tabernacle, the needs of the tabernacle, and they're also dispersed throughout to minister to the people. And chapters 3 and 4 are going to really focus on Levi, specifically the sons of Kohath, and how to relate to clean people versus unclean people. And we talked about what all that meant last week. Sinful versus holy. You can go back to that lesson and check that out. But and in chapter 7, we also have two celebrations of the Passover, which is the great sacramental meal of the Old Covenant people. The first one is for those who are in a state of ritual cleanness. The second one is for those who were not able to attend the first. Nonetheless, the point is that from chapter 3 to chapter 10, this whole section on preparation, 7 out of 10 chapters are focused on what? Well, they're focused on the worship of God. Preparation begins with worship. Again, the land of Canaan is the promised land. It is a real geographic location that they were going to. But the point is, it's a placeholder for something else. And in many ways, the book of Numbers might be the most applicable and the most directly relatable book in the Old Testament for us as New Testament believers. Why? Well, the book of Hebrews in many ways is a commentary on Leviticus, but it's also a sermon on Psalm 95. Did you know that? Which is covering this same wilderness wandering period for the people of Israel. And so the book of Numbers is directly applicable to us because God also prepares us for the new heavens and the new earth. He prepares us for the new Jerusalem. He prepares us for heaven through what means? Through worship. That is the primary means that God uses to prepare his people to dwell with him. What we do in the sanctuary on Sunday mornings and maybe evenings, if you have that service, ought to be regarded as the most important part of your week, because you are there preparing. You are being made fit for dwelling with God forever. And, yes, through the faith in the blood of the Lamb, absolutely, through a resolve to live holy obedience to his command. And yes, he's preparing you in those ways as well, but he's also preparing you through the rhythm of worship. We prepare to dwell with God for all eternity by entering into his presence in a corporate worship. That is where we come out of the wilderness of this world. That's the beauty of the Lord's Day. We set aside all the cares, all the concerns, and all the problems of this world, that we might focus on dwelling with God. And in chapters 10, verses 11 to 12, we read, in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month, the cloud lifted over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the people of Israel set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai. So the preparation has been set. It's complete. And now we are ready to move, right? The cloud has arisen, and it is ready to lead them out from the camp at Sinai. And so as we move at that very key transitional point, we'll move into our second section, or section rather, sorry. God protects his people by purifying them. Okay, so we've seen they're accounted, or they're accounted for, they're organized, they're all ready to go, and they set out following the cloud on the wilderness journey. And 3 days into the departure, we get to chapter 11, and things go downhill very quickly. Does anybody want to take a guess on what happens at the beginning of chapter 11? The people complain. They begin to grumble, first about their misfortunes. It's hot. It's uncomfortable. I don't like the wind, the sand. It's everywhere. Just whatever it might be. They're grumbling about these things in a general sense. But then it gets specific also. They begin to grumble specifically about the food. Remember how good we had it in Egypt. Remember the fish and the melons and all of these things. And Moses' patience in chapter 11 is already worn thin. They're 3 days into the journey, and Moses asked God to kill him. And I'm not making that up, right? I'm not exaggerating. If you look at chapter 11, beginning in verse 14, he says, I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once. If I find favor in your sight, that I might not see my wretchedness. And so Moses is saying, God, I realize that I've been called to lead your people for the rest of my life, and I want to fulfill that call. It'd be really great if you could just end my life now, because I fulfilled that call then. That's what he said, right? That's the beginning of the journey, and this is a people who needs to be purified. This is a people who needs purification, and it just gets worse after that. It's already bad enough that Moses would like to die because the people are just complaining all the time. What's next is his right and left hand, in a sense, if you will, his assistants, the people that are supposed to be on his team, rebel against him, and his own brother and sister, Miriam and Aaron, also rebel against Moses, and they try and take his authority, and the Lord himself has to step in and intervene. And he actually strikes Miriam with leprosy as a judgment for her trying to take that authority that did not belong to her. But the kicker, the straw that really broke the camel's back is when they send out the spies in chapter 14. And you guys know what happens with the spies, right? He sends the spies on ahead to check out the promised land, and what do they come back and say? Well, they said this place is great. This place is everything God said it would be. It's absolutely beautiful. But we don't stand a chance because the men that dwell there are giants. There is no way that we could possibly take this land. While it's great and worthy of all the promises that God has made to us, the people there are too great for us to overcome. And here's what they said, straight from the scriptures, chapter 13, verse 27 and 28. We came to the land which you sent us, and it flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. So they bring back evidence of how great the fruit is. However, the people who dwell in this land are strong, and their cities are fortified and very large. Now, in contrast, Caleb says in verse 30, let's go up at once and occupy it, for we are able to overcome it. Now, what's interesting about Caleb's response is not, he doesn't say, they're not that big. The city's not that well guarded. We're not that outmatched. He doesn't try and appeal to that. He says, no, we are able to do it. So what the other spies said is true. They are giants. They have massive military equipment, but we are able to. Why? Because God is with us. And he says that in chapter 14, verse 8. He says, if the Lord delights in us, and he does, he will bring us into this land and give it to us. Caleb believes, like the old Scottish Presbyterian minister John Knox said, any man with God is always in the majority. I love that quote from John Knox. Any man with God is always in the majority. So there are two sides, right? We can believe God's promises. God said he would give us this land, or we can doubt them. We can believe that God is able to do what he said he would do, who, by the way, has been, right the whole time, right? He has kept everything so far, or we can shrink back in fear. Those are the choices. There is no third option. You either believe the promise or you don't. To be unsure is to disbelieve. You either believe the promise or you don't. And the reality is God will not fail to keep his promises, even in the lack of faith of his people. Even in the lack of faith of his people. And he hands down the judgment for this lack of faith in chapter 14, verses 28 to 37. And I won't read the whole passage, but the gist of it is this. This generation who has seen 10 plagues, who has seen the parting of the Red Sea, who has seen the Red Sea swallow up their enemies, they heard my voice thundering from the cloud at Mount Sinai. They experienced my mercy when they worshiped the golden calf. Immediately after that, they've received all this and still don't trust me. This generation will die before we get to the promised land. But I will still keep my promise to Abraham, because their children, the next generation, will go in. What's the notification? Oh, great. Hold on, guys. I think this... Did this stop recording? No, I think we're good. Okay. Next generation will go in. So, anyway, sorry about that. But when I looked back up, it looked like it had stopped recording. God will not fail to keep his promises for the lack of faith of some. And you know that's the same choice, though that is left to us, right? God, what I'm saying is God will keep his promises to his church. God will keep his promises to his people. But we also, every generation has to ask themselves, do I believe these covenant promises that have been declared to me or not? And that's not just, my interpretation and trying to bring the text up to the modern day. That's the Apostle Paul's interpretation of this same book. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, 1 to 12, he's going to say, here, wait, let's go there. Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians 10, 1 to 12, so he's going to say this: they were baptized just like you were baptized. They ate and drank of the same spiritual food that you do, the Lord's Supper. They partook of all of that, and yet they fell away. these things are an example for you. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and that's sort of paraphrasing it, but if you want to look that passage up later, it's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 1 to 12. If you want to read the whole thing, 1 to 12. So we have to decide, are we going to believe the promises of God, or are we going to fall away? Right? The state of our faith, it is probably not something that we inquire about enough. Peter says, make your calling and election sure. The Westminster Larger Catechism speaks of all the ways that we ought to improve upon our baptism by remembering the promises that were declared to us in that. But we really ought to investigate the quality of our faith, because it's not just the faithless generation that has been grumbling from the start that's going to suffer that punishment. Who else suffers that same punishment of not being able to enter the promised land? Moses, the most holy of them all. Now it's worth noting that failure to obtain the earthly shadow of the promise is not saying that Moses will be cast out of the kingdom of glory. He's not being put out of heaven, as it were, but it is worth noting that because even Moses' lack of faith, Numbers 20 verse 20 says this. Numbers 20 verse 20 says, You did not believe me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel. Therefore, you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I've given them. Now, we have every reason to believe Moses is in heaven. Okay? But the point is that there are earthly, temporal, in this life consequences that are real for our own sin and our own failure to uphold God as holy, right? Now this is a people, all of whom need purification. And God does not purify his people in what is to me probably the most interesting episode in the whole book. And it's really the episode on which the whole narrative turns. So let's look at it for a moment. Numbers 21, and I'll read the passage for us as we'll talk about it with the time that we have left. But Numbers 21, beginning in verse 4. So this is a long period of that first generation dying out. Some in battles that are lost, some in Korah's rebellion, which is just a terrible way to go, and many just many other events. And so here's where it starts to turn. Numbers 21 verse 4. From Mount Hor, they set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the beginning became, and the people became impatient on the way. And when I transcribed this, I almost accidentally wrote again, because I assumed that's what the text said, but it doesn't. It says, but the people were impatient on the way, and the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of the land of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. So wait a second, right? There is no food, and we loathe this worthless food that you've given us? There's not food? They are being provided for, just not the way that they would prefer. They prefer the things of Egypt. They prefer things the way they were. Look at verse 6. Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died. And the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said to Moses, Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole. and everyone who has bitten, when he sees it, shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. And if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. What in the world? Why? Why a serpent? If you've been following along in the Bible, serpent generally not a good combination or connotation, right? What's the first thing that we think of when we think of serpent in the Bible? Satan, right? It's also direct imagery that's associated with the Pharaoh in Egypt. Why is it that the symbol to look at and find purification, why a serpent? Do you guys see the quandary there, right? Like what in the world is going on? Looking at the serpent is an acknowledgement of sin. That, it's just an interesting interpretation. God is powerful enough to work good in all things, even the most evil. Okay, that's another theologically true statement. God is powerful enough to work good in all things, even that which is evil, right? And that's part of how the book of Genesis ends, right? With Genesis 50, verse 20, you meant it for evil, but God meant it, what? The same thing, for good. I think the best way to understand this is a direct reference to Pharaoh and, by extension, Satan and the powers of evil. And I really think it's best summed up by one commentator. One commentator said this: it was God's reminder of the statues of the powers of Egypt, those powers to which the complainers wished to return. The gods of Egypt were dead, and those who worshiped them could become like them. The bites of the serpent were likely reminders of the sting of slavery. The sting of slavery, perhaps even the sting of Egyptian whips. So he's saying, you guys who were just complaining 2 verses ago about how good you had it in Egypt, did you forget this part? In contrast, the God of Israel was the living God who demonstrated his superiority over Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt, and has sustained them in the wilderness for 40 years. So in other words, Moses is doing what the Lord is having Moses do by holding up the bronze serpent, and it's saying that this is the power of the world, and I hold it in my hands, as if it's not. And you need to remember that the victory has already been won. You have been already delivered. The promised land is as good as yours. We just need to go get it. Look at your greatest enemy. I own him. I've conquered it. This is mine to give you. And this text is actually the setup to what is probably the most famous verse in the entire Bible, John 3:16, right? For God so loved the whole world, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that whosoever shall believe in him should not perish but have eternal life. Well, what did Jesus say to Nicodemus right before that in John 3:14? And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. In other words, we are purified as the people of God when we look at Christ, when we look to what he has done for us on the cross, when sin and death were conquered, were defeated, and we are purified, made holy before the Lord as we live out the reality and the implications of that, as we are no longer concerned with the problems down here that are real. Okay, but remember that the ultimate things have already been dealt with. The ultimate guilt, the ultimate source of suffering in this life has been dealt with. And lastly, and I really hate to have to rush this, but God protects his people by preserving them. And this is really the rest of the book. And I would really encourage, if you go back to look at just part of the book of Numbers later this week, look at chapters 22 to 24. This is the story of Balaam and Balak. Okay, Balak is a pagan. Balak is a pagan king, and he and he has heard what the Lord did to Egypt, right? And he has seen how the tides have turned for Israel, even in the wilderness, as they start to conquer other kings like Sihon and Og, and so he gets Balaam the prophet, and he hires him to curse the people, and he tries this 3 times. Okay, but every time when the prophet goes to pronounce a curse over the people of God, he actually winds up speaking a blessing. He intends to pronounce curses on them, but he can't do it because God will not allow his people to be cursed. And Deuteronomy 23:5 says this, "Yet the Lord your God," that's Moses talking about this very episode, "Yet the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam. Instead, the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you because the Lord your God loved you." It's a simple point, right? But it's important. Simple but important. The reason that God preserves, purifies, and protects his people is because he loves you. Jeremiah 31, till death do us part, and God's faithfulness to the covenant that he has made with his people. And that's absolutely true. One commentator said this: Jeremiah 31, 3-4 conveys the eternal love and faithfulness of God towards his people. It reminds us that God's love is unwavering, unending, and without condition. He extends his love and kindness to us, even in our imperfections, drawing us back to him. But I want you to know that it's not just because God made a promise and he can't break his promises. It is true that God can't break his promises. It is true that he did promise, but he doesn't want to break his promises. Okay? The reason God does all this for you is not because he's boxed himself in. It's because he loves you, and so he will prepare you. He will purify you, and he will preserve you in this life because he loves you as he leads you into the promised land. Let's just close with Revelation 21:3. "Behold, the dwelling place, the tabernacle of God is with man, and they will be with him as his people, and God himself will be their God, because the Lord your God loves you, and he turns the curse into a blessing." How beautiful is that? That's going to end our lesson on the book of Numbers. Guys, I thank you very much for taking the time out to listen. Have a blessed day, and we'll see you next time. God bless.